They called them soft. They called them undisciplined. They called them a mongrel nation of materialistic individualists who could never produce real soldiers. German propaganda had spent years building an image of Americans as decadent, racially mixed, incapable of the sustained violence that modern warfare demanded. Wehrmacht officers who had conquered Poland in weeks, crushed France in 6, and driven deep into the Soviet Union believed they understood what it took to build a fighting army. And by their standards, Americans did not have what it took. And then the Americans landed at Normandy. What happened next shattered every assumption the German military had built over years of ideology and won devastating early victories in the deserts of North Africa. From the blood-soaked sands of Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, to the apocalyptic killing ground of the Falaise Pocket in August, German soldiers recorded a transformation in their understanding of their enemy that went far beyond simple military reassessment. They experienced something closer to psychological rupture, a complete collapse of the framework through which they had understood the war. This is the story of that shock told through the words of the German soldiers themselves, the commanders who watched their certainties crumble, and the statistics that explain why everything they believed turned out to be catastrophically wrong. Before we understand what shocked German soldiers in Normandy, we need to understand what they believed before the Americans arrived. And to understand that, we need to go back to a place called Kasserine Pass and the assumptions that were built there. German contempt for American military capability ran deep and drew from multiple sources. Racial ideology, cultural stereotypes, and one devastating early battlefield encounter all combined to create a picture of American soldiers as fundamentally inferior. Nazi propaganda portrayed Americans as a mongrel society of materialistic individualists, incapable of producing disciplined soldiers. This was not a new idea. A United States Army intelligence report compiled after World War I documented the persistent German view that America was a money-hunting nation too engrossed in the pursuit of the dollar to produce a strong military force. A Prussian official in that same report dismissed the American Army as a mob, pure and simple, despite grudgingly admitting that Americans were impressive physical specimens. The memory of 1918, when American troops had helped turn the tide on the Western Front, had somehow been processed through a filter of denial. Yes, the Americans had come, and yes, the war had been lost, but German military thinking attributed this to numbers and timing rather than fighting quality. The Americans had arrived when Germany was already exhausted. They had won through weight, not skill. Real soldiers, the thinking went, would always defeat them in a fair fight. 25 years later, nothing seemed to have changed in German thinking. If anything, the contempt had deepened, reinforced now by Nazi racial theories about the supposed weakness of democratic multiracial societies. The Führer himself had proclaimed that the mixture of races in the United States made them incapable of the unified will that war demanded. Then came Kasserine Pass, and the Germans believed their prejudices had been proven correct. In February 1943, in the mountains of Tunisia, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps delivered what many historians consider the worst defeat in American military history. Rommel's panzers smashed through Major General Lloyd Fredendall's II Corps with contemptuous ease. The German attack exploited poor American positioning, weak leadership, and inexperienced troops who had never faced combat against a first-rate enemy. Fredendall himself was a disaster of a commander. He had established his headquarters in a ravine 70 to 100 miles behind the front, where his engineers spent their time blasting elaborate dugouts rather than preparing defensive positions. He issued confusing orders using private codes that his subordinates could not understand. He had quarreled with his division commanders and failed to coordinate his forces. When Rommel attacked, the result was predictable chaos. The numbers were devastating. American forces suffered approximately 6,500 casualties, with 300 killed, 3,000 wounded, and 3,000 missing. They lost 183 tanks, 104 half-tracks, and 208 artillery pieces. German casualties totaled fewer than 1,000 men, a kill ratio that seemed to confirm every prejudice about American fighting ability. General Omar Bradley, who would later command American forces at Normandy, called it probably the worst performance of United States Army troops in their whole proud history. The defeat was so complete, so humiliating, that it seemed to validate everything the Germans believed. Replacements arriving to fill the gaps were so poorly prepared that the 168th Infantry Regiment received 450 new troops, many of whom had never completed basic training. Some of them did not even have rifles. American units had broken and run. Tanks had been abandoned intact, their crews fleeing in panic. Chaos had reigned in the face of determined German attack. For the Germans, Kasserine confirmed everything they wanted to believe. Here was proof that Americans were exactly what Nazi propaganda claimed: a soft people incapable of the sustained violence that real war demanded. The lesson seemed obvious. Americans might have factories and ships and planes, but they did not have soldiers. They could build weapons, but they could not fight. Stories from North Africa spread through the Wehrmacht like a virus of overconfidence. Officers who had faced Americans returned with tales of easy victories, of enemy units that collapsed under pressure, of an army that seemed to lack the fundamental qualities necessary for modern warfare. German soldiers passed these stories around, building a collective certainty about the nature of their future enemy. By the time the invasion of France loomed in 1944, German soldiers had internalized a dangerous certainty. The Americans would be easier than the Russians, who had proven their toughness in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. Easier than the British, who had held out alone in 1940. Perhaps the easiest enemy of all. General Alfred Jodl, the OKW operations chief, sneered before D-Day that they would see who fights better and who dies more easily: the German soldier faced with the destruction of his homeland, or the Americans and British who did not even know what they were fighting for in Europe. The arrogance was complete. The assumptions were fixed. The trap was set. What these confident German officers failed to notice or chose to ignore was what happened after Kasserine. The American response to disaster was not despair but transformation. Within weeks of the defeat, General George Patton took command of 2 Corps. Patton was everything Fredendall was not. He established his headquarters at the front, not 70 miles behind it. He imposed iron discipline, demanding pressed uniforms, mandatory helmets, and proper military bearing at all times. He drove his men through relentless training, conducting live-fire exercises that more closely resembled actual combat than anything the Army had experienced. Patton was brutal, theatrical, and utterly effective. He purged incompetent officers without mercy, relieving commanders who failed to meet his standards regardless of their rank or connections. He demanded excellence at every level, from private to general. Within weeks, he had transformed a demoralized rabble into something dangerous. At El Getter in late March 1943, just weeks after Kasserine, that same reformed 2 Corps fought the 10th Panzer Division to a standstill. The same German unit that had routed Americans a month earlier found itself unable to break through. American artillery, which had been poorly coordinated at Kasserine, now delivered devastating fire on German formations. American infantry, which had fled in panic, now held their positions under tank attack. Something had changed, and the change was fundamental. Rommel himself had glimpsed something different even during his victory at Kasserine. In his papers, he noted that the tactical conduct of the enemy defense had been first class and that they had recovered very quickly after the first shock. Even in defeat, some American units had fought well. Even in chaos, the recovery had begun faster than expected. But this nuanced assessment never penetrated the broader German institutional mindset. The Wehrmacht saw what it wanted to see. Americans were weak. Kasserine proved it. Nothing more needed to be said. The Americans who would land at Normandy 16 months later were not the same army that had stumbled in Tunisia. They had fought their way across Sicily and up the Italian peninsula. They had faced German defenders in mountain passes and river crossings. They had learned, adapted, and improved. General Dwight Eisenhower wrote in Crusade in Europe that Patton's buoyant leadership and strict insistence upon discipline rapidly rejuvenated the 2 Corps and brought it up to fighting pitch. But the Germans did not know that yet. They would learn soon enough. On the morning of June 6, 1944, an 18-year-old German machine gunner named Franz Gockel sat in a concrete bunker overlooking a stretch of beach the Allies had codenamed Omaha. Gockel had been born on December 30, 1925, in the small town of Nadeggen in Westphalia. He was young, barely old enough to serve, but the Wehrmacht in 1944 was drawing on every available man. Gockel belonged to the 3rd Company of the 726th Infantry Regiment, part of the 716th Static Infantry Division. His position was designated WN62, Widerstandsness 62, one of the strongest defensive points on the entire Normandy coast. The number meant nothing to him then. It would become famous. The defenses at Omaha were formidable. The beach featured 8 concrete bunkers housing artillery pieces of 75 mm caliber or larger. 35 pillboxes dotted the bluffs. 18 anti-tank guns covered the approaches with overlapping fields of fire designed to catch landing craft and vehicles in a crossfire from which there was no escape. 85 machine gun nests commanded the open sand. 35 Nebelwerfer rocket launcher sites waited to rain destruction on anyone who reached the shore. The beach itself was a killing ground by design. 400 yards of open sand stretched from the waterline to the base of the bluffs. Anyone crossing that sand would be exposed to fire from multiple directions with no cover whatsoever. Behind the beach, a seawall and shingle bank offered some protection, but reaching it meant surviving the crossing. The bluffs rose steeply, channeling any advance into draws that had been registered for artillery fire. Every approach had been studied, every avenue of attack prepared for. At 6:30 in the morning, Gockel watched the largest amphibious invasion in human history unfold before his eyes. Through the early morning haze and the smoke of the preliminary bombardment, landing craft churned through rough seas toward the beach. The weather was terrible that day, worse than the planners had hoped. The channel was rough. Landing craft pitched and rolled in the swells. Soldiers who had been crammed into those boats for hours, many of them seasick and miserable, now had to drop into water that was deeper than expected and struggle toward the sand under a hail of machine gun and artillery fire. The sea was rough that day. Many soldiers drowned under the weight of their equipment. The packs they carried weighed 60 pounds or more, and when they dropped into deep water, some never made it to the surface. Others were cut down before they could take cover, shot in the water or on the wet sand of the tidal flat. The first waves at Omaha suffered catastrophically. For days later, on June 10th, Gockel wrote a letter to his parents. It contains what may be the most significant German testimony about American determination from the entire Normandy campaign, remarkable because it was written immediately, not shaped by decades of hindsight or the knowledge of how the war would end. Then the killing began, he wrote. There was shooting for all the barrels could hold. Soon the whole beach was full of Americans. Many uninjured also remained lying on the sand, but when the water came, they too had to move on. In the process, they were again taken under fire by us. And then the crucial observation, the sentence that captures the essence of German shock at Normandy. We could not understand that they kept coming in the hail of fire despite their heavy losses. The 100-fold superiority probably eliminated each of us. We could not understand that they kept coming. This single sentence encapsulates everything that would follow in the weeks ahead. A teenager writing to his parents in the immediate aftermath of battle captured what experienced generals would later confirm. Everything German soldiers had been told about American softness was being disproven in real time, and they could not comprehend what they were seeing. Gockel fired over 400 rounds with his rifle that day at ranges of 100 to 250 meters. His weapon became so hot it burned the grass around him. The barrel glowed. The wood of the stock grew too hot to touch comfortably. Still, he fired. At approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, shot through the hand, he left his position briefly and encountered Americans who had already infiltrated nearby. The beach was being overrun. The defensive line that had seemed so strong that morning was collapsing as small groups of Americans found paths through the obstacles and worked their way behind the German positions. WN62 was defended by just 40 men, 27 from the 716th Static Infantry Division and 13 from the 352nd Infantry Division. These few dozen soldiers faced a force that would eventually number over 130,000 Americans in the first 48 hours alone. The presence of the 352nd Infantry Division had been largely missed by Allied intelligence. Its Eastern Front veterans seeded through the ranks as non-commissioned officers were supposed to stiffen the defense. They did. Omaha was the bloodiest of the D-Day beaches, with casualties estimated between 2,400 and 3,700 men. But it was not enough. By 8:25 that morning, elements of Company G, 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, had breached WN62 by attacking from the rear. Small groups of Americans had found paths up the bluffs and worked their way behind the German positions. The defenders who had been pouring fire onto the beach now found enemies behind them, attacking from directions they had not expected. When American prisoners later asked captured Germans, "Where are the others?" implying disbelief at how few defenders had inflicted such carnage, the question itself testified to the ferocity both sides had displayed. 40 men had held up an army, but the army had kept coming. Gockel survived the war. He was eventually captured and spent time in American custody. In 1958, he returned to Normandy for reconciliation, meeting the mayor of Colleville-sur-Mer. He subsequently devoted himself to Franco-German and German-American friendship, maintaining correspondence with veterans from both sides until his death on November 22, 2005. The statistics of D-Day told the story of overwhelming force that German soldiers simply could not match, a disparity so vast it bordered on the incomprehensible. The Allies deployed approximately 11,590 aircraft for the invasion. The Luftwaffe had 815 available in the region. The ratio was not merely unfavorable. It was catastrophic. In actual sorties flown on June 6, the disparity was staggering. Nearly 12,000 Allied aircraft flew over 14,674 sorties on June 6 alone. Bombers pounded German positions inland. Fighters provided cover over the beaches. Transport aircraft dropped paratroopers behind enemy lines to seize bridges and road junctions. The sky belonged to the Allies absolutely and completely. Against this aerial armada, the Luftwaffe managed only 319 sorties the entire day. Among the first and most famous German aircraft over the beaches were just 2 fighters flown by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Priller and his wingman, Sergeant Heinz Wudersick of Jagerschwader 26. Priller told Wudersick before their strafing run over Sword Beach that they were going in alone, and he did not think they were coming back. They made their pass and survived. But the contrast between these scattered German sorties and the thousands of Allied aircraft overhead was not lost on the soldiers below. Within 48 hours of the initial landings, over 130,000 American troops and 17,000 vehicles had come ashore. The buildup was relentless. Ships disgorged men and material around the clock. Artificial harbors called mulberries were constructed to speed the flow of supplies. By the end of June, over 850,000 troops, 570,000 tons of supplies, and approximately 148,000 vehicles would be in France. German soldiers watching this influx could see their doom taking shape. Every day brought more Americans. Every destroyed tank was replaced by 2 more. Every fallen soldier was replaced by fresh troops from the endless reserves across the Atlantic. The phrase Materialschlacht, material battle, became the German soldiers' defining term for the experience. They were not just fighting an enemy. They were fighting an industrial civilization operating at full wartime production. After the beaches, the Americans faced a terrain that German soldiers believed would finally stop the invasion. The Norman bocage, a landscape of ancient hedgerows that had grown for centuries into natural fortresses. Each field in Normandy was surrounded by earth dikes, earthen berms that had accumulated over hundreds of years of farming. These dikes stood 3 to 5 feet high, their sides packed hard over centuries of rain and growth. From the top of each berm grew tangled vegetation, hedges and trees and bushes that could reach 10 to 15 feet in total height, including the growth from the earthen base. The roots were intertwined so deeply that the hedgerows were essentially walls impervious to anything short of explosives. The fields themselves were small, often no more than 200 yards across. Every hedgerow was a defensive position. Every field was a kill zone. Roads ran between the hedges in sunken lanes, perfect for ambushes. The terrain negated every American advantage in armor, artillery, and air power. No American unit had trained for this terrain. The bocage did not exist in England, where they had prepared for the invasion. It did not exist in North Africa, where they had first faced German forces. Nothing in American military experience had prepared them for fighting through these natural fortresses, field by bloody field, hedge by hedge. General Bradley called it the damnedest country he had ever seen. Tanks could not push through the hedgerows without exposing their thin belly armor to waiting anti-tank weapons. When a Sherman tank tried to climb over a hedgerow, its nose rose into the air, presenting its vulnerable underside to German Panzerfaust teams hidden in the next field. Infantry advancing across open fields were cut down by machine guns firing from positions invisible until it was too late. German units held significant firepower advantages in this close terrain. A standard German infantry company typically fielded 12 to 16 machine guns and roughly 16 submachine guns. The American Rifle Company opposing them had just 2 M1919 light machine guns and 9 Browning automatic rifles. In the close confines of the bocage, this disparity in automatic weapons was devastating. Every hedgerow became a fortress defended by machine guns that American infantry could not suppress. German defenders had pre-registered virtually every yard of forward slope for mortar and artillery fire. They knew the terrain intimately after weeks of preparation. They had established overlapping fields of fire. Every American advance meant crossing open ground under the guns of an enemy who had already calculated exactly where to aim. Initial American performance was costly. The 83rd Infantry Division, committed to combat for the first time near Saint-Denis on the Corentin-Puriers Road on July 4th, suffered approximately 1,400 casualties on its first day of fighting. For this price, they advanced roughly 200 yards. The mathematics were unsustainable. At that rate, breaking through the bocage would consume the entire American army. The battle for Saint-Lô, fought from July 7th through July 19th, exemplified both the cost and the gradual refinement of American tactics. The 3rd Parachute Division defending the approaches to Saint-Lô was one of the finest units in the German army. Elite paratroopers with extensive combat experience on multiple fronts. Their companies fielded even more firepower than standard infantry, with 20 machine guns and 43 submachine guns per company. They lost 464 men in just 3 days of fighting, but they made the Americans pay for every yard. The 29th Infantry Division's 2nd Battalion, 116th Infantry, started its attack at approximately 900 men. Within 3 days, it had fallen below 1/3 strength. Total American casualties in the battle for Saint-Lô reached roughly 11,000 over nearly 2 weeks of fighting. But it was precisely in this brutal fighting that German commanders began recording a grudging reassessment of their enemy. The Americans who should have broken under this punishment were not breaking. They were adapting. They were learning, and they were getting better at killing Germans. Colonel Friedrich von der Heydt commanded the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, elite German paratroopers who fought the American 101st Airborne Division at Corentin. His men were among the best soldiers in the Wehrmacht, veterans who had jumped into Crete and survived the Eastern Front. In his post-war manuscript for the United States Army Historical Division, he provided one of the war's most significant professional assessments of American fighting quality. The caliber of the American paratroopers who fought against the regiment was outstanding, he wrote. They were excellently trained in combat techniques, and their armament and equipment were first class. The regiment experienced similar stubborn fighting only against the Russian NKVD divisions, the British 52nd Highland Division, and the Canadian 1st Infantry Division. For a German officer to compare American soldiers favorably to the feared Soviet NKVD troops, the elite security forces of Stalin's regime known for fanatical determination in combat, was extraordinary. To place Americans in the same category as the battle-hardened British and Canadians represented a complete reversal of pre-war assumptions. The men who had been dismissed as soft had proven themselves the equal of any soldier in the world. The Americans' capacity for bottom-up innovation proved decisive in breaking the bocage deadlock. In mid-July 1944, a sergeant named Curtis G. Cullen III, serving in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron under V Corps, proposed a simple solution to the hedgerow problem. Cullen was not a general with access to vast resources. He was not an engineer with specialized training. He was a non-commissioned officer from Cranford, New Jersey, who had watched tanks die against hedgerows and thought there had to be a better way. His idea came from observation and common sense, not from any manual or doctrine. His suggestion was elegantly simple. Weld steel tusks to the front of Sherman tanks, heavy prongs that could dig into the hedgerows and tear through them instead of riding up and over. The tusks would keep the tank's nose down, protecting its vulnerable belly armor, while the engine's power drove the steel teeth through centuries of roots and soil. The raw material for these tusks came from an ironic source: the captured German beach obstacles that Rommel had ordered planted to stop the invasion. The very steel meant to prevent American tanks from landing was now being welded to those tanks to break the German defensive line. Rommel's own defenses were being turned against his army. When General Bradley watched a demonstration on July 14, he was astonished. He later wrote in A Soldier's Story that it was so absurdly simple that it had baffled an army for more than 5 weeks. Within 2 weeks, approximately 60% of 1st Army tanks were equipped with the device. Roughly 500 assemblies were built from Rommel's own beach obstacles. The Rhino, as it came to be called, shattered the German defensive scheme, which depended on channeling American armor through predictable gaps where anti-tank weapons waited. Now tanks could attack through any hedgerow anywhere at any time. This was not a solution imposed from headquarters. It came from a sergeant in a reconnaissance unit. That a non-commissioned officer's idea could be tested, approved, manufactured, and deployed across an entire army in less than 2 weeks demonstrated an institutional flexibility that the Wehrmacht's rigid hierarchy could not match. The American military encouraged innovation from below. Ideas flowed from privates to generals. The German military did not work that way. No single German testimony captures the shock of American firepower more vividly than the accounts of General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the elite Panzer Lehr Division during Operation Cobra on July 25, 1944. Cobra was designed to break the stalemate in Normandy through the application of overwhelming force concentrated in time and space. The plan called for carpet bombing a narrow sector of the German line, followed by immediate exploitation by armored forces. The scale of firepower was unprecedented in the history of warfare. Approximately 1,800 heavy bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, were dispatched from England, with roughly 1,500 actually dropping bombs on target. Behind them came 600 fighter bombers and hundreds of medium bombers. Roughly 3,000 aircraft in total participated in the operation. They dropped over 4,000 tons of bombs, plus tens of thousands of incendiaries, on a 12-square-kilometer area. The Earth itself seemed to dissolve under the impact. Simultaneously, more than 1,000 artillery pieces opened fire. 7th Corps alone expended approximately 140,000 rounds. 8th Corps added another 27,000. The barrage continued for hours. The ground shook so violently that soldiers miles away thought there was an earthquake. The air filled with smoke, dust, and the screaming of shells. Bellin's testimony in post-war interrogations, preserved at the National Archives in the ETH series, documents 66, 67, and 69, provides one of the most extensively documented German commander perspectives from the entire campaign. The bombers came as if on a conveyor belt, he said. My front lines looked like a landscape on the moon, and at least 70% of my personnel were out of action. Dead, wounded, crazed, or numbed. The shock effect on the troops was indescribable, Ballin continued. Several of his men went mad and rushed around in the open until they were cut down by splinters. Simultaneously with the storm from the air, innumerable guns of American artillery pounded drumfire into their positions. The psychological impact was perhaps even more devastating than the physical destruction. Men who survived the bombing were often unable to function. They sat in their holes, staring at nothing, unable to respond to orders or think clearly about what to do next. The long duration of the raid, Bayerlein explained, without any chance of fighting back, created depression, a feeling of powerlessness, weakness, and inferiority. When Field Marshal von Kluger's emissary arrived demanding that Berlin hold the line, his reply became one of the war's most quoted passages. Out in front, everyone is holding out, he said. Everyone. My grenadiers and my engineers and my tank crews. They are all holding their ground. Not a single man is leaving his post. Not one. They are lying in their foxholes, mute and silent, for they are dead. Dead. You may report to the field marshal that the Panzer Division is annihilated. Only the dead can now hold the line. Panzer had been one of the Wehrmacht's finest formations, a demonstration division equipped with the best tanks and crewed by veterans of multiple campaigns. Before Cobra, the division had only about 28 operational tanks remaining from months of attrition. After the bombing, only about 7 tanks remained in working order. One of Germany's elite divisions had been functionally destroyed in a single afternoon. The broader German collapse during Cobra produced equally devastating testimony from soldiers at every level. Helmut Gunther of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had survived the retreat from Moscow in the winter of 1941, compared what he saw to the darkest days of the war against Russia. "I had seen the first retreat from Moscow, which was terrible enough," he said. "But at least units were still intact. Here we had become a cluster of individuals." The professional German soldiers, the men who had conquered Poland and France and driven deep into the Soviet Union, found themselves outclassed by an enemy they had dismissed as amateurs 16 months earlier. Hans Stober, author of the 17th SS Division's combat history, observed with what could only be professional admiration that the Americans had learned how to break through, ignoring their flanks and pushing on. The Americans had essentially learned blitzkrieg and were using it against its inventors. The tactics that had conquered Europe in 1940 were now being employed by the people the Germans had most underestimated. What made American power in Normandy so psychologically devastating was not just its scale, but its inexhaustibility. German soldiers faced an enemy that seemed to have unlimited resources, and in practical terms they were correct. The American industrial base behind the invasion had produced staggering quantities of material that German factories could not begin to match. During the war, American factories turned out 297,000 military aircraft. They built 86,000 tanks. They produced nearly 2.4 million military trucks to keep those armies rolling forward. They manufactured more than 41 billion rounds of small arms ammunition. 2/3 of all Allied equipment came from American factories. German supply problems told the opposite story. Allied air interdiction had made regulated railway supply to Normandy impossible. As early as mid-May 1944, trains trying to reach the front were bombed, trucks were strafed, and fuel depots were destroyed. German artillery supporting 5th Panzer Army in Normandy could fire only approximately 10% of what the Allies fired due to chronic ammunition shortages. Air superiority created a psychological environment unlike anything German soldiers had experienced, even on the Eastern Front, where Soviet air power had grown formidable by 1944. P-47 Thunderbolts and other Allied fighter bombers made daytime movement virtually suicidal. The P-47 was particularly feared, a massive fighter armed with 8.50 caliber machine guns and capable of carrying bombs and rockets for ground attack missions. Major Helmut Ritken of Panzer, who later published his memoirs as the Western Front 1944, described roads monitored by the murderous circling Thunderbolts, where one had to play Russian roulette by trying to outwit the pilots. Panzer marched to Normandy before the invasion had already cost the division 84 half-tracks, 5 tanks, and 130 trucks to air attack alone before they had even reached the battle. German soldiers called the routes to the front the Jabo-Rennstrecke, the fighter-bomber racecourse. Losses that could never be replaced were being inflicted before units even reached combat. General Eugen Mindel, commander of 2 Fallschirmjäger Corps, told a staff officer that it took him 4 hours to drive 9 miles because of fighter bombers. Every time aircraft appeared, everyone had to dive for cover and wait for them to pass. His assessment was grim. "Tomorrow's attack is going to be a failure," he concluded. "The time has come when Normandy can no longer be held." The Americans possessed another advantage that baffled German military professionals. They were the only power in World War II with full-time on-target capability, a technique where multiple artillery batteries coordinated their fire so that all shells arrived simultaneously. This meant troops had no warning. They could not hear shells coming and take cover as they normally would. Everything arrived at once, catching the maximum number of soldiers exposed. German prisoners of war frequently remarked on the heavy volume of American fire and its terrifying precision. Rommel himself had acknowledged this reality. "Also in evidence," he wrote, "is their great superiority in artillery and an outstandingly large supply of ammunition." Senior German commanders reached the same conclusions independently, each coming to understand that the campaign was lost despite their professional excellence and their soldiers' bravery. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, Supreme Commander in the West, reached his breaking point by July 1. When General Wilhelm Keitel called from OKW headquarters in Germany asking what they should do, Von Rundstedt had heard enough of unrealistic demands from leaders who did not understand the situation on the ground. He snarled 4 words that would become famous: "Make peace, you fools." He was relieved of command. The next day, his successor, Field Marshal von Kluge, arrived skeptical of what he considered frontline pessimism. Surely the situation could not be as bad as the reports suggested. Surely German soldiers could hold if they showed sufficient determination. Von Kluge had commanded armies in Russia. He knew what German soldiers could endure. After touring the Normandy front and seeing conditions for himself, von Kluge reached identical conclusions to the man he had replaced. "I am no pessimist," he told his staff on July 12. "But in my view, the situation could not be grimmer." The 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division's war diary captured the operational collapse in visceral detail. "The entire valley we are in seems to be on fire," the diarist wrote. "Thick columns of smoke rise from the shot-up vehicles. Amongst them, ammunition shoots upwards. Everyone streams to the rear." Rommel's own assessment, delivered before D-Day, proved grimly prophetic. "If we can't throw the enemy into the sea within 24 hours, he had warned, then that will be the beginning of the end. They did not throw the enemy into the sea, and it was the beginning of the end. The Falaise Pocket, formed between August 12th and 21st, delivered the campaign's final catastrophic judgment on German forces. It was the greatest German military disaster in the West since Stalingrad, a pocket of destruction from which there was no escape. American troops driving east from the Operation Cobra breakout linked up with British and Canadian forces pushing south, trapping the remnants of the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army in a shrinking encirclement. The pocket grew smaller every day as Allied forces pressed inward from all directions. Approximately 80,000 to 100,000 German troops were caught inside. The losses were staggering. Between 10,000 and 15,000 were killed. 40,000 to 50,000 were captured. Only 20,000 to 50,000 managed to escape through a corridor that shrank to barely 2 miles wide between the villages of Chamboy and St. Lambert. Those who escaped left behind everything but the weapons they carried. Nearly all heavy equipment was abandoned. Tanks that had rolled through the fields of France were left burning or out of fuel. Artillery pieces that had shelled the beaches were captured or destroyed. Of approximately 2,300 tanks and assault guns committed to the entire Normandy campaign, only 100 to 120 managed to cross the same river. The German army in the West had been functionally destroyed. At least 25 of 38 German divisions were utterly wrecked. When counting all divisions ever committed to the campaign, including reinforcements brought in during the fighting, 55 divisions were rendered combat ineffective during the Normandy campaign. Dwight Eisenhower toured the battlefield 48 hours after the gap closed. What he saw left him shaken, and Eisenhower was not a man easily disturbed. "It was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time," he wrote, "stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh." Pilots flying over the pocket reported smelling the carnage from hundreds of feet in the air. The summer sun accelerated decomposition. The area was declared an unhealthy zone and marked for special cleanup operations. Even hardened combat soldiers who had seen death on multiple battlefields could not stomach what they found there. Total German losses in Normandy reached approximately 290,000 casualties, 23,000 dead, 67,000 wounded, and roughly 200,000 missing or captured. The Luftwaffe lost over 2,100 aircraft. By September, OB West had only 13 infantry divisions, 3 panzer divisions, and 2 panzer brigades rated combat effective. Allied casualties totaled approximately 226,000, including 37,000 killed on the ground and approximately 16,700 airmen. The price had been terrible, but the outcome was decisive. Among the German soldiers who survived, a dark humor took hold in the final weeks of the Normandy campaign. Graffiti appeared on walls throughout the rear areas. A phrase spread through the ranks that captured their psychological state with sardonic precision. Geniessen den Krieg schnell. Lasst uns den Krieg geniessen. Den der Frieden wird schrecklich sein. Let us enjoy the war because the peace will be terrible. They knew what was coming. They had seen American power firsthand, and they knew that nothing could stop it. Now, the German experience in Normandy demolishes a persistent myth that sometimes appears on both sides of the Atlantic, the idea that American victory was purely a matter of material superiority, that the United States simply buried its enemies under an avalanche of equipment produced by workers safe from the war. The documented record reveals something more complex and more impressive. German soldiers were shocked not only by American resources but by American determination, American adaptability, and American willingness to absorb casualties and continue fighting. Gaull's bewilderment that Americans kept advancing at Omaha, Wenda's comparison of American paratroopers to elite Soviet divisions, Hans Stober's professional recognition that the Americans had learned how to break through, these testimonies all point to the same conclusion. The United States Army that landed in Normandy was barely recognizable as the force humiliated at Kasserine Pass 16 months earlier. The transformation encompassed everything. Leadership changed, with incompetent commanders like Fredendall replaced by warriors like Patton and Bradley. Doctrine evolved, with combined arms integration and air-ground coordination reaching new levels of effectiveness. Equipment improved, with innovations like the Rhino tank emerging from the ranks and spreading across the force in days rather than months. Most importantly, institutional culture adapted. The American military developed a capacity for organizational learning that the Wehrmacht, trapped in its rigid hierarchies and ideological certainties, could not replicate. Mistakes were studied, failures were analyzed, and lessons were implemented. The army got better steadily and relentlessly while German forces ground themselves down against an enemy that refused to fight the way they expected. Fritz Bayerlein's Panzer Lehr Division was not merely bombed into oblivion. It was outfought by an army that had learned to combine overwhelming firepower with tactical adaptability at a speed Germany could not match. The soft Americans turned out to be among the hardest enemies Germany ever faced. Today, the beaches of Normandy are quiet. The bunkers at WN62 are preserved as memorials. The hedgerows still divide the Norman countryside into their ancient patterns. Tourists walk the sands where Franz Gockel watched waves of Americans advance through his machine gun fire and wondered why they would not stop. The lessons of Normandy remain relevant. Underestimating an enemy based on prejudice rather than evidence can be catastrophic. Industrial capacity matters, but so does the spirit of the soldiers who use the equipment those factories produce. Rigid ideological certainties blind leaders to realities that their frontline troops observe clearly, and democracies, for all their apparent disorder, can produce military forces that match or exceed any authoritarian regime's finest units. The German soldiers who faced Americans in Normandy carried their shock with them for the rest of their lives. Some, like Franz Gockel, returned decades later to make peace with former enemies. He devoted his final years to reconciliation, building bridges between nations that had once tried to destroy each other. He was awarded the Federal Cross of Merit by the German government and made an honorary citizen of Colleville-sur-Mer by the French. His journey from machine gunner at WN62 to ambassador for peace exemplified the transformation that was possible even after the most brutal combat. All of them had learned the same lesson, paid for in the lives of their comrades and the destruction of their army. The Americans they had been taught to despise had proven themselves in the hardest test of all. The assumptions of Kasserine had been overturned completely. The mongrel nation had produced soldiers as tough as any in the world. If this video helped you understand what really happened when German soldiers faced Americans in Normandy, consider subscribing for more historical analysis that goes beyond the myths to find the documented truth. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and check out our other videos on World War II, where we continue to explore history through the eyes of those who lived it. Until next time, remember that history is not just about what happened. It is about understanding why it happened and what it teaches us about ourselves.